The night the camera changed everything. Sandra Bullock had always believed that silence could be protective. Over the years, she had learned to surround herself with it, not as a wall meant to shut the world out, but as a careful boundary that allowed her to breathe without constantly explaining herself. That evening, her home rested in that familiar calm, the kind that settled only after the day had fully let go of its noise. Outside, the city moved on in distant murmurs, but inside, everything felt suspended, as if time itself had slowed to match the rhythm of her thoughts. She had finished her work early, turned off unnecessary lights, and allowed the quiet to settle around her like a trusted companion. It was in moments like these that she reflected most deeply, not on fame or success, but on the small, unseen moments that shaped who she had become. She hadn't planned to check the security monitor. It was almost instinctive, a casual glance prompted by nothing more than habit. The screen flickered softly as it activated, showing the familiar angles of her property, the empty driveway, the still garden, the front gate bathed in muted light. Everything looked exactly as it always did, predictable and uneventful. Sandra was about to turn away when movement caught her eye, subtle at first, almost easy to miss. A figure stood near the edge of the frame, unmoving, not approaching, not retreating, simply present in a way that felt strangely deliberate. She leaned closer to the screen, her breath slowing as recognition dawned in a way that felt unreal, as though her mind were playing an elaborate trick on her. Even after all these years, she would have known that posture anywhere. The way he stood, hands relaxed but slightly tucked inward as if trying to take up less space than he occupied, carried a familiarity that sent a quiet shock through her chest. It was Keanu Reeves. Not the version the world saw on screens and stages, but the man she had once known in quieter moments. The man who listened more than he spoke, who carried his kindness without announcing it. For several long seconds, she didn't move, she didn't speak, she didn't even blink. The screen showed him standing there under the dim light, his expression unreadable, his presence almost hesitant, as though he were unsure whether he belonged in that space at all. There was no urgency in his posture, no expectation. He wasn't knocking on the door, he wasn't calling. He was simply there, as if waiting without demanding to be acknowledged. That more than anything else unsettled her, because it felt so deeply like him. Memories stirred quietly, not as sharp intrusions but as slow, steady waves. She remembered laughter that came easily in moments when neither of them was trying too hard, conversations that stretched late into the night, and silences that never felt awkward. She also remembered the distance that followed, the years where paths diverged and words went unsaid, not because of anger, but because life had a way of pulling people apart without ever explaining why. Seeing him now, standing outside her door without announcement, brought all of that rushing back with a force she hadn't prepared for. Sandra's first instinct was not to open the door, not out of fear but out of uncertainty. There was a safety in observing from a distance, in allowing the moment to exist without stepping fully into it. She watched as Keanu shifted his weight slightly, glancing down for a moment as if reconsidering his presence, then looking back toward the house with the same quiet patience. He didn't seem frustrated. He didn't seem anxious. He seemed reflective, as though simply being there had meaning of its own. What Sandra couldn't see on the screen, but somehow felt all the same, was the weight that had brought him there. Keanu had not arrived on impulse. For him, nothing meaningful ever happened that way. He had spent days, perhaps weeks, turning the decision over in his mind, questioning whether this moment was necessary or whether it would disrupt a peace he had no right to disturb. He wasn't there to ask for anything. He wasn't there to reopen old chapters for his own sake. He was there because sometimes, when kindness has no outlet, it quietly searches for a place to land. Inside the house, Sandra wrapped her arms around herself, not out of cold, but as if grounding herself in the present. She was aware of her own heartbeat now, steady but insistent, reminding her that this was real, that the past was no longer safely contained in memory. She thought about how much had changed since the last time their lives had meaningfully intersected, how much pain and growth both of them had carried separately. She wondered briefly whether this was a coincidence or something more deliberate, something shaped by timing that neither of them could control. The security camera continued its silent vigil, capturing a moment that neither of them knew would become pivotal. Keanu looked up again, not toward the camera, but toward the door itself, as if sensing her presence beyond it. His expression softened in a way that suggested he wasn't expecting the door to open, but wasn't entirely closed to the possibility either. It was a look filled with respect, with acceptance of whatever outcome might come. In that look, Sandra saw something that moved her deeply. Not regret, not longing, but understanding. She thought about the years when she had needed that kind of understanding most, the moments when the world felt loud and demanding, when expectations pressed in from all sides. Back then, Keanu had been someone who never asked her to be anything other than what she was in that moment. Seeing him now, waiting quietly instead of interrupting her peace, reminded her of that gentle consistency. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't grand. It was simply human. Time stretched in that suspended way it sometimes does when something important is unfolding. Sandra knew she could choose to let the moment pass. She could turn off the screen, return to her evening, and carry the image of him standing there as nothing more than a fleeting interruption. It would be easier, perhaps safer. But she also knew that some moments, once presented, ask more of us than comfort. They ask us to acknowledge the ways we have been shaped by others, even when those connections were never fully defined. Outside, Keanu took a slow breath, the kind that comes from someone who has already made peace with uncertainty. He wasn't watching the door anymore. His gaze had shifted to the ground, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. If the door opened, he would meet that moment with openness. If it didn't, he would leave quietly, carrying no resentment with him. For him, showing up had already been an act of courage, and that was enough. Inside, Sandra felt something shift, subtle but unmistakable. It wasn't obligation that moved her, nor curiosity alone. It was a recognition that some connections, no matter how much time has passed, don't demand explanations. They simply exist, waiting patiently for the moment when both people are ready to acknowledge them again. She took one step toward the door, then paused, letting herself feel the weight of that choice without rushing it. As her hand hovered near the light switch by the entrance, she glanced once more at the screen. The image of Keanu standing there, calm and unassuming, felt like a quiet invitation rather than a request. Whatever happened next, she sensed, would not be loud or dramatic. It would be something far more lasting, something rooted in empathy and the kind of kindness that doesn't need witnesses to be real. And in that stillness, with the security camera silently recording a moment neither of them could have predicted, Sandra Bullock made a decision that would begin to change everything, not because it erased the past, but because it honored it with the possibility of something new. The door that was never meant to open. The sound of the door unlocking was so quiet that it almost felt imagined, yet to Sandra it echoed louder than anything she had heard all evening. She hadn't rushed the decision, hadn't acted on impulse or sentimentality, but as the lock turned beneath her fingers, she realized that some choices are made long before we consciously acknowledge them. The door opened slowly, not with hesitation, but with a kind of deliberate calm, as though she were honoring the moment by giving it the space it deserved. The night air slipped inside, cool and faintly scented with earth and distant city lights, carrying with it the subtle weight of everything that had led to this exact point. Keanu looked up at the sound, his expression shifting in a way that revealed more than words ever could. There was surprise, yes, but it was gentle, softened by relief and something deeper, something almost like gratitude. He didn't step forward immediately, didn't assume the invitation was unconditional. Instead, he remained where he was, his posture open but respectful, as if waiting for her to define the distance between them. When their eyes met, the years between them seemed to collapse, not disappearing entirely, but rearranging themselves into something manageable, something human. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward or strained. It was full, layered with unspoken understanding. Sandra noticed how familiar his presence still felt, how it carried the same quiet steadiness she remembered, unchanged by time or circumstance. She became acutely aware of the small details, the way the porch light caught the edges of his features, the stillness in his hands, the patience in his gaze. This wasn't a man who had come to disrupt her peace. This was someone who had come prepared to protect it, even if that meant leaving without ever crossing the threshold. "You didn't knock," she said finally, her voice calm but thoughtful, not accusatory, simply observant. Keanu offered a faint, almost self-conscious smile, one that suggested he had anticipated the question. He nodded slightly, as though acknowledging something obvious. He explained in a tone that matched the night's quiet that he hadn't wanted to interrupt, hadn't wanted to impose. He had only needed to be there to know he had tried. His words were simple, unembellished, but they carried weight because they were honest. There was no expectation hidden within them, no request for reassurance or explanation. Sandra listened, not just to what he said, but to what he didn't. She heard the care in his restraint, the awareness of boundaries that came from someone who understood how fragile peace can be. She recognized that this moment wasn't about revisiting old memories or reopening past conversations. It was about presence, about showing up without demanding anything in return. In that realization, she felt her initial uncertainty soften into something warmer, something steadier. She stepped aside, not dramatically but naturally, creating space without explicitly inviting or refusing him. The gesture was small, but its meaning was clear. Keanu noticed immediately, his expression shifting again, this time with a quiet acceptance. He stepped forward slowly, crossing the threshold with the same respect he had shown from the moment he arrived. The door closed behind him, not sealing them away from the world, but marking a subtle transition from observation to connection. Inside, the house felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because the atmosphere had shifted. The silence remained, but it was no longer solitary. It became shared, a space where neither of them felt the need to fill the air with unnecessary words. Sandra gestured toward the living room, and they moved there together, their steps unhurried, as if neither wanted to rush what was unfolding. Keanu took in the room with quiet curiosity, not searching for familiarity, but appreciating the life she had built within it. They sat across from each other at first, the distance neither uncomfortable nor forced, simply reflective of the time that had passed. Sandra noticed how easily her body relaxed in his presence, how the guarded tension she often carried seemed to ease without conscious effort. She wondered when she had last felt that kind of unspoken ease, that sense of being seen without scrutiny. It wasn't something she experienced often, and she realized she had missed it more than she had allowed herself to admit. Keanu spoke sparingly, choosing his words with care, not because he was afraid of saying the wrong thing, but because he respected the weight of the moment. He shared that he had been in the city briefly and felt compelled to see her, not to rekindle anything or to seek closure, but because certain connections leave an imprint that time cannot erase. He admitted that he had debated whether coming was the right choice, whether it would disrupt her life or reopen things best left untouched. In the end, he said, he trusted that kindness, even when misunderstood, was still worth offering. Sandra absorbed his words slowly, allowing them to settle without rushing to respond. She felt no pressure to explain herself, no need to justify the choices she had made in the years they'd been apart. Instead, she found herself sharing something quieter, something more immediate. She spoke of how she had learned to value stillness, how she had built her life around protecting moments of peace. She admitted that she rarely allowed surprises anymore, not because she feared them, but because she had grown careful with her energy. Seeing him on the security camera, she said, had reminded her that not all unexpected moments are disruptive. Some arrive gently, asking only to be acknowledged. The conversation flowed without force, guided by mutual respect rather than nostalgia. They didn't dwell on the past or attempt to redefine it. Instead, they spoke about the present, about how each of them had changed in ways that were subtle but significant. Sandra noticed how Keanu listened with the same attentiveness she remembered, his focus unwavering, his responses thoughtful rather than reactive. In that attentive presence, she felt something shift again, a quiet reassurance that she didn't have to perform or explain herself to be understood. As the night deepened, the space between them seemed to shrink, not physically, but emotionally. The initial formality softened into familiarity, the kind that doesn't erase boundaries but acknowledges shared history with care. Sandra realized that opening the door hadn't been about inviting someone back into her life in a defined way. It had been about honoring a connection that had always existed, even when unspoken, even when separated by time and circumstance. Keanu, for his part, felt a sense of calm settle over him when he hadn't anticipated. He hadn't come seeking comfort, yet he found it in the quiet acceptance of her presence. He understood that whatever this moment became, it didn't need to be named or explained. It simply needed to exist, free from expectation. That understanding allowed him to relax fully, to be present without guarding himself against disappointment. When Sandra eventually stood to refresh their drinks, the movement felt natural, unhurried, as though the evening had found its own rhythm. Keanu watched her for a moment, not with longing, but with appreciation for the strength and grace she carried so effortlessly. He realized then that the most meaningful changes rarely announce themselves. They begin quietly in moments like this, when a door opens not to the past, but to the possibility of understanding in the present. As they settled back into conversation, both of them sensed that something fundamental had shifted, not dramatically but deeply. The night outside continued as it always had, indifferent to the quiet transformation taking place within those walls. Yet for Sandra and Keanu, that simple decision to acknowledge one another had already begun to reshape the way they understood connection, reminding them that kindness, when offered without expectation, has the power to change everything. The past neither of them spoke about. As the night continued to unfold, the house seemed to settle into a quieter rhythm, one that mirrored the unspoken understanding forming between them. The conversation slowed, not because there was nothing left to say, but because both Sandra and Keanu sensed that they had reached a more delicate layer of the evening, a space where words mattered more and silence carried greater weight. The earlier ease had not disappeared, but it had deepened, becoming something more reflective, more honest. Sandra noticed how the ticking of the clock in the adjoining room suddenly felt louder, marking time in a way that reminded her how rare moments like this truly were. Keanu leaned back slightly, his hands resting loosely, his gaze thoughtful rather than distant. There was something he had been carrying for a long time, something that had followed him through years of movement and change, and now, sitting across from Sandra in the soft glow of her living room, he felt that quiet pull again. It wasn't regret that weighed on him, but the awareness of things left unsaid, moments where understanding might have arrived sooner if words had been braver. He hadn't come with a rehearsed confession or a list of explanations. He had come simply willing to be honest if the moment asked for it. Sandra sensed the shift before he spoke, just as she always had. She had learned over time to read the spaces between people's words, to notice when a conversation was approaching something more vulnerable. Instead of pressing or filling the silence, she allowed it to exist, giving him the room to decide whether he wanted to step into it. That patience, she knew, was its own form of kindness, one she had learned through years of navigating a world that often demanded immediate answers. When Keanu finally spoke, his voice was calm but deliberate, carrying the weight of careful reflection. He spoke not about a single event, but about a pattern, about how easily life had pulled them in different directions without ever truly separating them emotionally. He admitted that there were times he had thought of reaching out, moments when he had wondered whether a simple message or a brief visit might have changed the course of things. Yet each time he had hesitated, not out of fear of rejection, but out of respect for the life he believed she was building. He hadn't wanted to be a disruption, even if that meant carrying his own questions in silence. Sandra listened intently, her expression open, her body still. His words resonated more deeply than she expected because they echoed thoughts she herself had carried quietly. She had often wondered whether distance had been chosen or simply allowed, whether both of them had mistaken respect for restraint. Hearing him articulate that uncertainty felt like recognizing a shared language neither of them had realized they were speaking. It wasn't an accusation or a lament. It was an acknowledgement of how easily people with good intentions can miss one another. She responded slowly, choosing her words with the same care he had shown. She spoke of how her life had gradually shifted inward, how she had learned to protect her time and energy after realizing how easily they could be consumed by expectations that offered little in return. She admitted that she had sometimes interpreted his silence as a sign that he was content to let things remain as they were, not because he didn't care, but because he was at peace. That assumption, she said, had allowed her to justify her own quiet withdrawal, telling herself that distance was mutual and therefore harmless. As she spoke, Sandra felt something loosen within her, a tension she hadn't fully recognized until that moment. It wasn't painful to revisit these thoughts, but it was illuminating. She realized that neither of them had been wrong, and neither had been entirely right. They had simply navigated their connection with caution, each trying to honor the other's space, even as that very caution created more distance than either intended. In that realization, there was no bitterness, only clarity. Keanu absorbed her words thoughtfully, nodding slightly as if each sentence helped him piece together a story that had long felt incomplete. He recognized himself in her description, in the way she spoke of mutual assumptions and unspoken boundaries. It occurred to him that kindness, when paired with silence, can sometimes obscure understanding rather than deepen it. The insight didn't feel like a failure. It felt like a lesson, one that had taken time to fully reveal itself. The conversation didn't linger on what might have been. Instead, it shifted gently toward what had been learned. They spoke about growth, about how pain and joy had shaped them in different ways, about how resilience often looks quieter than people expect. Sandra reflected on the ways she had learned to stand firmly in her own life, to choose peace over chaos even when it meant standing alone. Keanu shared how he had come to value presence over outcome, how he had learned that showing up, even briefly, mattered more than controlling how a moment would unfold. As the hours passed, the space between them felt less defined by time and more by intention. They weren't trying to reclaim the past or rewrite it. They were acknowledging it with honesty, allowing it to inform who they were now without dictating who they needed to be. Sandra noticed how this approach brought her a sense of calm she hadn't anticipated, a reassurance that closure doesn't always require endings, and understanding doesn't always demand explanations. At one point, the conversation paused again, not because it had reached a dead end, but because both of them were reflecting on what had been shared. The quiet that followed was different from the earlier silences. It was warmer, more settled, as though something unresolved had finally been given permission to rest. Sandra felt a sense of gratitude, not just for Keanu's presence, but for the way the evening had unfolded without pressure or expectation. Keanu, too, felt that subtle shift, a release he hadn't known he needed. He realized that coming here had never been about seeking answers or reassurance. It had been about offering honesty without agenda, about trusting that connection, when rooted in empathy, can withstand time and distance. Sitting there now, he felt a quiet confidence that whatever followed this night, it would be shaped by clarity rather than assumption. As the clock edged closer to morning, Sandra became aware of how deeply the conversation had touched her. She recognized that the decision to open the door had done more than allow someone inside her home. It had allowed her to revisit a part of herself she had carefully set aside, not out of fear, but out of self-preservation. Reconnecting with that part now felt less like reopening a wound and more like acknowledging a scar that had healed. In that shared understanding, both Sandra and Keanu sensed that the night had marked a turning point, not because it promised anything specific, but because it had reframed how they viewed one another and themselves. The past they had never spoken about no longer hovered unaddressed between them. It had been gently brought into the light, examined with compassion, and allowed to take its place as a chapter rather than an unanswered question. And as the first hints of dawn began to soften the edges of the night, they both understood that whatever came next would be guided not by what they had missed, but by what they had finally chosen to see. When silence became louder than words, by the time the night gave way to the soft uncertainty of early morning, the world outside Sandra's windows had begun to shift in subtle ways, though inside the house, time seemed almost irrelevant. The conversation between her and Keanu had slowed not because it was finished, but because it had reached a depth where words no longer felt necessary to carry meaning. There was a stillness in the room now that felt different from the quiet Sandra was used to, less solitary and more shared, as if the silence itself had become a presence acknowledging what had been said and what no longer needed to be. She noticed how comfortable that silence felt, how it didn't demand anything from her, and that realization surprised her more than anything else that night. Keanu sat quietly, his gaze drifting not toward Sandra but toward the faint light filtering through the window, as though he were reflecting on something beyond the immediate moment. He had always believed that silence could be revealing, that it often said more than carefully chosen words ever could, and sitting there now, he felt that truth more strongly than ever. He wasn't searching for what to say next. Instead, he was allowing the space between them to settle naturally, trusting that whatever mattered most had already found its way into the open. It was a patience shaped by years of learning that presence, when genuine, does not require constant articulation. Sandra watched him from where she sat, noticing the ease with which he occupied the space without trying to control it. There was no performance in his stillness, no expectation that the moment needed to lead somewhere specific. That absence of pressure felt almost unfamiliar to her, and she realized how rarely she allowed herself to exist without anticipating the next demand or decision. In his quiet presence, she felt a sense of permission to simply be, to let the moment unfold without guiding it or guarding herself against it. The silence stretched, not awkwardly but thoughtfully, and in that space Sandra found her thoughts turning inward. She reflected on how much of her life had been shaped by responsibility, by choices made to protect her peace, even when those choices meant closing certain doors without fully understanding what lay behind them. She realized that she had grown accustomed to carrying her strength alone, not because she didn't value connection, but because she had learned to survive without relying on it. Sitting across from Keanu now, she felt that familiar independence soften, not weaken, but expand, as though strength could include openness without being diminished by it. Keanu sensed the shift in her before she spoke, just as he always had. He understood that some moments call not for reassurance or explanation, but for quiet acknowledgement. He didn't reach out or interrupt her reflection. He simply remained present, grounded in the understanding that empathy often reveals itself through restraint rather than action. In that shared stillness, he felt a deep respect for the life she had built, for the resilience that had carried her through experiences he could only partially imagine. When Sandra finally spoke, her voice was calm, but there was an honesty in it that carried weight. She spoke about how rarely she allowed herself to revisit moments like this, not because they were painful, but because they challenged the careful balance she had created in her life. She admitted that opening the door had felt like a risk, not because of who he was, but because of what the moment represented. It had reminded her that connection, even when gentle and respectful, has the power to change the shape of one's inner world. Keanu listened without interruption, his expression attentive but unobtrusive. He recognized the vulnerability in her words and understood that it wasn't an invitation for reassurance or persuasion. It was simply an acknowledgement of truth. When he responded, he did so quietly, sharing that he, too, had learned to live within carefully drawn boundaries, not out of fear, but out of an awareness of how fragile meaningful connections can be. He spoke about how he had come to value moments of shared understanding over defined outcomes, believing that the truest form of kindness is allowing people to remain whole in your presence. As their exchange settled into another stretch of silence, both of them felt its significance deepen. It was no longer the silence of uncertainty or reflection. It was the silence of mutual recognition, of two people acknowledging the impact they had on one another without needing to define it. Sandra realized that this kind of quiet connection was something she had been missing, not because it was absent from her life entirely, but because she had rarely allowed it to linger without immediately categorizing or controlling it. The early light outside continued to grow, casting soft shadows across the room, and Sandra became aware of how symbolic the moment felt without trying to assign it meaning. She understood that whatever this night represented, it wasn't a promise or a resolution. It was a pause, a space where understanding could settle without being rushed toward conclusion. That realization brought her a sense of peace she hadn't anticipated, one that felt earned rather than accidental. Keanu, too, felt the weight of the moment, though he experienced it with a quiet steadiness that came from acceptance rather than anticipation. He recognized that the most profound changes often happen internally, without fanfare or declaration. Sitting there, he felt a renewed appreciation for the power of presence, for the way empathy can reshape a moment without demanding anything in return. He understood that this night, regardless of what followed, had already fulfilled its purpose simply by existing. As the silence eventually gave way to the gentle sounds of the waking city, both Sandra and Keanu sensed that they had crossed an invisible threshold, not one marked by decisions or declarations, but by understanding. The silence between them had grown louder than words, not because it demanded attention, but because it carried the weight of mutual respect and quiet care. In that shared stillness, they both recognized that something within them had shifted, subtly but irrevocably, setting the stage for whatever choices lay ahead. The choice that could break or heal them. As morning settled fully into the world outside, the quiet inside Sandra's home began to feel less like a pause and more like a crossroads. The night had carried them gently through reflection and understanding, but daylight brought with it a subtle sense of accountability, as if the moment now asked something of them beyond acknowledgement. Sandra felt this shift acutely, not as pressure, but as awareness. She understood that some moments once lived quietly ask us to decide whether we will let them fade into memory or allow them to change the way we move forward. Sitting there with Keanu, she felt that question rising within her, not demanding an answer but patiently waiting for honesty. Keanu sensed the same undercurrent, though he experienced it differently. For him, the night had already been complete in its own way, meaningful without requiring continuation. Yet he was not unaware of the weight the moment now carried. He knew that presence, once offered, creates responsibility not to outcomes, but to truth. He didn't want to leave without acknowledging what had been shared, nor did he want to impose a direction that belonged to neither of them yet. The balance between honoring the moment and respecting her autonomy felt delicate, and he approached it with the same care that had guided him there in the first place. Sandra stood slowly, moving toward the window as if drawn by the light outside. The city looked different in the morning, less mysterious, more exposed, and she realized that she felt the same way. Turning back toward Keanu, she spoke with a clarity that surprised her, admitting that the night had stirred something she hadn't allowed herself to confront in a long time. She explained that while she had built her life around stability and peace, she had also learned how easily those qualities could become walls rather than foundations. Opening the door to him had reminded her that safety doesn't always come from distance, and that sometimes the bravest thing is not protecting yourself from change, but choosing how to engage with it. Keanu listened, his attention unwavering, aware that this was not a confession meant to draw him closer or push him away. It was simply truth, offered without expectation. When he responded, his words were measured and sincere. He spoke about how he had learned to live without attaching himself to outcomes, how he believed that connection should never feel like obligation. He acknowledged that coming here had not been about seeking a place in her life, but about honoring a connection that had shaped him in quiet ways. Whatever she chose next, he said, he respected it fully, because kindness to him had always meant allowing others the freedom to choose without influence or guilt. The weight of his response settled deeply within Sandra, touching something tender but steady. She realized that this was the choice before her, not between closeness and distance, but between fear and intention. She understood that healing does not always come from preserving what is comfortable, but from recognizing when growth asks for courage. The presence Keanu offered was not demanding or consuming. It was calm, grounded, and rooted in respect. That realization made the choice clearer, even as it remained emotionally complex. She spoke again, this time acknowledging that while she did not know what shape this reconnection might take, she knew she did not want to retreat from it out of habit or fear. She explained that she was not ready to define anything, not because she was unsure, but because she believed some things deserved time to grow without labels. What she was willing to offer, she said, was openness, a willingness to allow their connection to exist honestly in the present rather than being confined to memory. Keanu felt a quiet sense of gratitude at her words, not because they promised anything specific, but because they reflected trust. He assured her that he shared that perspective, that he had no desire to rush or define what did not yet need definition. For him, the most meaningful choice was always to meet the present moment with integrity, allowing whatever followed to emerge naturally. In that shared understanding, he felt a deep sense of alignment, not as an expectation, but as a mutual recognition of values. As they prepared for the practical realities of the day, the energy between them remained calm but purposeful. There was no awkwardness, no sudden emotional intensity that demanded resolution. Instead, there was a shared awareness that something had shifted, not dramatically, but fundamentally. Sandra noticed how that awareness felt grounding rather than unsettling, as though she had made peace with the uncertainty rather than trying to eliminate it. When they stood near the door, the same door that had felt so significant hours earlier, Sandra realized that this moment mirrored the first choice she had made that night. Once again, she was standing at a threshold, but this time the decision was internal. She could close herself off after he left, returning to the safety of solitude, or she could allow the understanding they had reached to remain part of her life, influencing how she approached connection moving forward. The choice, she realized, was not about Keanu alone. It was about how she wanted to live. Keanu paused before leaving, not out of hesitation, but to acknowledge the significance of what had passed between them. He expressed his appreciation for her honesty and her willingness to meet the moment without defensiveness. He reminded her gently that whatever direction she chose, her strength lay not in control, but in authenticity. His words were not meant to persuade, only to affirm what he already believed about her. As the door opened and the morning air filled the space once more, Sandra felt a sense of quiet resolve. She understood that the choice she had made to remain open rather than retreat carried risk, but it also carried the possibility of growth. Watching Keanu step outside, she didn't feel the familiar instinct to withdraw. Instead, she felt present, grounded in the knowledge that healing often begins not with certainty, but with the willingness to stay engaged. The door closed gently behind him, and Sandra stood there for a moment longer, aware that this was not an ending, nor was it a beginning in the traditional sense. It was something more nuanced, a turning point shaped by intention rather than impulse. The choice that could have broken or healed them had been made quietly, not through declarations or promises, but through mutual respect and the courage to remain open to what lay ahead. What changed everything forever? Days passed after that morning, yet the quiet transformation that had begun that night continued to unfold within Sandra in ways she hadn't anticipated. Nothing dramatic happened in the external sense. There were no sudden changes to her routine, no announcements or declarations that marked a clear shift. Yet internally, something fundamental had been realigned. She noticed it in the way she moved through her days, less guarded, more attentive to moments she might once have dismissed as insignificant. The memory of opening the door, of choosing presence over retreat, lingered not as a question, but as a quiet reassurance that she was capable of meeting life with openness without losing herself in the process. Keanu, too, carried the night with him, though he did so without revisiting it obsessively. For him, its impact revealed itself subtly, in moments of stillness when he found himself reflecting on the nature of connection and the courage it takes to show up without expectation. He felt a renewed sense of peace, not because the encounter had promised continuation, but because it had affirmed something he had always believed yet rarely experienced so clearly. That kindness, when offered sincerely and without agenda, has a way of returning to us in forms we cannot predict. The night had not rewritten his past or defined his future, but it had grounded him more firmly in the present. When they eventually spoke again, it wasn't planned or formalized. It happened naturally, without ceremony, as if both of them trusted that the connection they had acknowledged didn't need constant validation to remain real. Their conversations were unhurried and thoughtful, shaped not by nostalgia, but by curiosity about who they were now. Sandra found herself appreciating the absence of pressure, the way their exchanges existed without needing to lead anywhere specific. In that freedom, she discovered a new kind of strength, one that allowed connection to coexist with independence rather than threaten it. Over time, she reflected often on the moment she had seen Keanu on the security camera, realizing how symbolic it had been. He hadn't arrived with noise or urgency. He hadn't demanded her attention or interrupted her peace. He had simply been there, waiting quietly, willing to accept whatever choice she made. That, she understood now, was what had changed everything. It wasn't the act of opening the door alone, but the recognition that true connection does not force its way into our lives. It stands patiently at the edge, respecting boundaries while offering presence. Sandra began to notice how this understanding influenced other areas of her life. She became more attentive to the ways she responded to people, more willing to listen without immediately retreating into self-protection. She realized that resilience is not only about enduring hardship alone, but about knowing when to allow understanding to soften the edges of that endurance. The night with Keanu had reminded her that empathy does not weaken us. It expands us, making room for growth without demanding sacrifice of self. Keanu experienced a similar shift, though it manifested quietly, as most meaningful changes do. He found himself more attuned to moments of shared humanity, more willing to trust that presence alone can be enough. The encounter had reinforced his belief that the most impactful actions are often the least visible, that showing up with sincerity can alter the course of someone's inner world without ever needing acknowledgement. In that sense, the night had affirmed his approach to life, reminding him that compassion, when practiced consistently, creates ripples far beyond the moment in which it is offered. As weeks turned into months, neither of them felt the need to define what the night had meant in absolute terms. It existed as a shared understanding, a reference point that neither clung to nor dismissed. Sandra understood now that the most powerful changes are rarely marked by dramatic turning points. They occur quietly, through choices made with intention rather than fear. The decision to open the door had not altered her life overnight, but it had changed how she understood connection, teaching her that openness does not require surrendering control, only releasing unnecessary defenses. Looking back, Sandra realized that what had changed everything forever was not the presence of Keanu alone, but what his presence had invited her to recognize within herself. She had been reminded that her strength did not come from isolation, but from discernment, from knowing when to allow connection without losing autonomy. The night had shown her that vulnerability, when chosen consciously, is not a risk to be avoided, but a tool for deeper understanding. Keanu, reflecting on the same night, recognized that its significance lay not in outcome, but in intention. He had gone there prepared to leave without being seen, content in the knowledge that he had acted with integrity. That willingness to show up without expectation had created space for something meaningful to emerge, even if it did not take a conventional form. In that realization, he found a quiet affirmation that living with kindness, even when it goes unnoticed, is never without impact. In the end, there was no single moment that defined what followed, no clear dividing line between before and after. Instead, the change revealed itself gradually, in the way both of them moved forward with greater awareness and empathy. The night the security camera captured Keanu standing quietly outside Sandra's door became a private reminder of what is possible when we choose courage over comfort, presence over avoidance, and kindness over assumption. What changed everything forever was not a dramatic reunion or a decisive outcome, but a simple human choice made in silence. A choice to open a door, not just to another person, but to understanding, growth, and the quiet power of empathy. And in that choice, Sandra Bullock discovered that resilience is not only about standing strong alone, but about knowing when to let connection gently reshape the way we live.